But yeah, back on the topics of black sails. Oh yeah, do you think that Charles Vane should have worn a wig, like in the general history of the fiction? If you've ever taken a look at the sources in my video description, you have most likely encountered a book written by Benerson Little. What's special about Benerson is that he focuses on every facet of pirate life, most primarily on their tactics. Aside from reading a ton of period material, he has often gone out himself and tried out stuff like pirate weaponry, food and clothing. I consider him one of the leading pirate historians today, and I'm not alone. He worked as the historical consultant on the TV series Black Sails, which you might be familiar with. In this interview, we will primarily talk about his experiences working with the series creators, what it's like to bring history onto the big screen, and his own thoughts on the series. So, let's get into it. There we go. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Yes. Excellent. Yeah, well, initially I wanted to use my camera, but sadly I don't have one on my stationary computer, which is where I have all of my recording software. But you'll have to do with this very funny picture.
Oh, I'm okay. It's like I said, it's if your personality is anything like that, it captures it well.
Yeah, it's similar on the good days at least. But yeah, why don't we get into the interview? Why don't you start by telling us a bit about who you are and what you do?
I'm Benerson Little. I've written a few books on the subject of piracy, a few articles as well. I got into it almost by accident. I was trying to write fiction early on and for practice, and I think you'll probably get into this later. I was going to try my hand at some swashbuckling fiction, more or less how to learn how to write a novel. And I was just out of the Navy. I spent about 8 years as a U.S. naval officer, and most of that as a Navy SEAL. And I realized as I was doing all this background search, there were a lot of similarities tactically, and realized that there wasn't a book on the subject, so I wrote it, and it just kind of snowballed from there. I continued writing book after book as long as I could get a publisher to, or as long as I could find a publisher who was willing to publish it. So that's about it. These days I spend as much time being a parent, second time around, as I do trying to write or research or anything else. So you'll probably have to question me to get more detail. I've always been awful at giving the short bios.
I think it's very interesting that you come from the approach of wanting to write fiction, and that's what get you into doing the research originally.
Exactly. I always liked storytelling. I kind of came from a family of storytellers, not published writers, but people who they told everything from anecdotes to fascinating old stories. I loved film, cinema as a child. I loved reading from an early age, and I really just liked telling the stories. And so I really had very little interest in writing nonfiction at first at all. I really just I didn't know that there was that much of a market out there. It is much, much easier to get nonfiction published.
Oh, yeah.
But on the other hand, it's if you can get it in advance, it's usually small, and publishers tend to treat nonfiction as just almost a quick fast food consumable almost. And getting back briefly to the subject of the balance between fact and fiction, it's there's a lot of things that we might realize intellectually, but we don't pay attention to. And then one day we're just suddenly struck by this fact. And that is that, we grow up about, I believe strongly in a free press, for example. Newspapers may have some of their flaws, but I'm a strong believer in a free press, a diverse press. And, I grew up, believing in authors and publishers, and, the old idea that publishers, they want to publish books about the truth and change the world. And I've sort of changed that idea, or that my viewpoint on that, to the degree that I think publishers do love the truth and printing the truth and will print the truth, but they're only going to do it if they think it's profitable. I know that may sound a little bit cynical, but you can present a publisher with this great book. This is fact. Nobody knows about it. It's on a cool subject, and given the problems we're having nowadays worldwide, with literally fiction or outright lies replacing fact. This would be a great book, and they just kind of roll their eyes and not interested in them.
Yeah, and of course that's a huge problem in the when you're talking about pirates, because it's been it's been so modeled by the fake facts and the
And that seems to be all that they really, really want. And you can have it both ways. I love the fiction and the character, even almost the caricature side of it. But at the same time, you can. It's like teaching. I teach fencing. I was fenced for years, and I was taught by some old masters many years ago that if you want to keep fencing while you're teaching, they're two very different things. In fencing, in theory, you don't want to get, the idea is to hit and not get hit. And sport fencing these days, it's either in epee, hit your opponent before they hit you, basically, or the other two, hit according to a certain set of rules, and they kind of disregard what you get hit in return. But teaching is the exact opposite. You're literally trying to get hit. You're setting up things, and so you almost have to build a partition in your mind between teaching and actually fencing, even if the fencing is for fun. Otherwise, you stand out there as an old French. He was a French Army colonel at the time, old friend of mine. When I first met him years ago, he said, you teach? He says, I love fencing, fencing masters and fencing teachers. He said, because you always hesitate like you're giving a lesson and I hit you. And it's very true. And so that same sort of dichotomy that you have is also between fact and fiction. You can literally understand both, but again, not trying to sound cynical, but I'm beginning to think that a lot of people, they want to hold one or the other. The majority like the fictional idea. It's just easier to hold. It plays to some very basic emotions, and they see these same images over and over, and it is very difficult to change people's opinions. They will, once they've seen an image, they'll come to believe it as fact, and you can drop fact after fact and argument on top of them and say, look, right here, fact, this did not happen. And they're like, well, I still don't think so. Like, I spent decades researching this and you looked at Wikipedia. Well, it's in writing. It's like, I've written, I know I can show you a dozen other authors who've written the same thing. I don't know. So it's kind of an amusing observation on the human condition.
Yeah, and I mean
it's nothing new.
Yeah, I mean the problem with the myths also is that it's a very shallow thing, because because it's fake, you can't really dig into it. You can't really discover more, so you're stuck on it.
Yeah, that's very perceptive. I hadn't thought about it that way. That's very, very. You should write that down.
Yeah, it came first to me today, actually, because I always wanted to tell people why they shouldn't stick to these myths, because of course I know a lot of people who just want to believe in the old stuff, cuffed boots, they're fine with that, and all that sort of stuff. But,
there was a UK journalist, I think, a few years ago during the Johnny Depp Pirates of the Caribbean movies. I think she called it fetish wear, and that's basically what it is.
Oh yeah.
And it's appealing. For me, the fictional aspect of piracy and pirate books is as much to do as with looking at the origins and the connections and why we have these myths and how we got there. And I like Sabatini's Captain Blood. I could pick it to death, nitpick it to death, and show all kinds of little errors, but they don't really change. Correcting them, you'd still have the same story. But I'm not going to put the book down or criticize the author. I'm not going to go on Goodreads, God forbid, and write some pompous, nasty little review that only other Goodreads reviewers are going to read about it, because I accept its place in history and especially its place in my life. And as I've gotten older, as you start reading this, you start realizing there are more insights in a lot of these books than you realized at the time. But the author was just kind of burying them because he's not going to detract from what his purpose is, and that's to get a best-selling romantic adventure. The constant theme in there is that these indentured rebels convict are slaves. They're not really slaves. There were thousands of true slaves on that island at the time. And they're kind of pushed in the background. And again, that's a product of the time, because people don't want to, even today, people really don't want to address the question of slavery and piracy in film. They don't even want to touch it. So I am addressing these things in depth in the annotations. And also there's some subtle racism in there. It's certainly not overt like in some novels I read that I may have seen televised versions or film versions of the when I was a child, and years later I went to read the original book on it. And there's times some of the books I've actually just put away because some of the racism is just so overt over the time that you can't overlook it as, just a common subtlety or a common trope of the time. It's just, this guy was a racist, I'm not going to read his book.
I see. Of course, the bulk of the first interview is going to concern the work that you did on Black Sails, the TV series. I mean, how did you first get contacted by them? I'm curious to hear that. Did they just like email you or hit you up?
I just got an email out of the blue one day, and it basically asked me, we're with Starz. We're going to do a pirate series. Could you take a look at a script for us and tell us what you think? So I sent me the script. I wrote a bunch of comments on it, and they sent me an email back saying, we really liked your comments, because one of the things that I did was not try to say, hey, you're wrong here, you're wrong here. It was more of, it's okay to use the term rifle. I said, when we're discussing these things, but in the text, you should call it, in your script in one of the lines, you should call it a musket.
Yeah.
I recognize that this was fiction, that it was a show built on a fictional novel. Although Treasure Island is probably more historically accurate in some ways than a lot of fiction that came after it.
Yeah.
But it's, I understood what they're trying to do, tell a story. And so I didn't want to get up on a soapbox and say, you can't do this, it's wrong. It was just suggesting different ways that they could do it. And how accurate do you want this? And, I'll be glad to help you. And basically a lot of the comments were rated from, this is historically accurate, you can do it, or you should do it. We don't know if this might be accurate, but it's plausible, all the way down to this is historically inaccurate, but it's too cool not to do it. And to the, oh, please don't do this, this is awful, it's a trope, and just please, whatever you do, stay away from it. And it's interesting. One other thing about that, it turns out the show's creators were very, very well read on the subject of piracy. They're not pirate experts, but they did what apparently most people in Hollywood don't do up front, is what I was told by a number of writers. And that is do extensive background reading. There's a bad habit, and I've been contacted by a number of screenwriters over the years. They'll write a script, and then they want to say, hey, can you look at this, and can you make it more piratey, and can you fix this? And it's like, well, I can't really, if you want to just you can slap some superficial tropes on it, but you don't need me for that. You can do it yourself. If you actually want to make this a little bit more historically accurate, you're going to have to go back and rewrite this scene. You're going to have to rewrite this one and rewrite that one. And and they think, well, you can give me a couple hours on the phone. And I'm like, no, we're talking, you need to rewrite this scene. Keep the same ideas, but you're going to have to change it. And it's just, but these at Black Sails, they didn't do that. They wanted to get everything done, do their reading up front. So these guys were not only well read, but they had run across several of my books. And I thought, well, it's the Sea Rover's Practice or something, the tactics book that they liked. And it turned out it was that the worst of all of them, How History's Great as Pirates. But what they liked about it was that they said, well, you're telling a story and you're slipping tactics and other things into it. And we really like that. So we think you could maybe do it on the script as well. And that's based on the comments I sent them back with the original script. They said, hey, we'll give you a monthly stipend. And, and I had a variety of things I did for them. But the two major areas I worked in was one, pre-script when they were developing the next episode was to sit down and consult me and say, hey, we're looking at this. Do you have any ideas? We're looking at that. Do you have any ideas? Can you take a look at this narrative arc? Or we're trying to develop this narrative arc. We've got a little bit of a scene, a climax right here. We need something, historical. Basically, here's where we want our characters to be. We need something historical or physical or something that's reasonably accurate that we can, build this scene around. That was a good part of what I did for them. The other part was every script as it was written was sent back to me basically for my comment. They took 50% of the comments. I mean, this is not it was a fictional series. They wanted to, and more than anything else, I was happy that they got some of the core facts about piracy If you recall in the early episodes, they're taking slaves, they're selling slaves. That's what pirates did. Every single pirate did. You're talking about slave-based economy in colonial America. It's what people did. The moral base I have in me cannot accept the fact that people did not recognize that was just utterly immoral. But it's gone on for a long time, unfortunately. There were some smaller areas that I did work on for them. Some of the marketing, they would send marketing materials, basically to fact check them. A few little videos. Swartz had to provide a bunch of material for their legal department because the so-called Calico Jack flag, they wanted to ensure that nobody actually had a copyright or a trademark on that. Yeah. So I basically, which was research I pretty much had anyway, but went all the way back to the origin of that flag and sent all that. And even then, if you'll notice, they did not use the popular version of it. They modified it a little bit in the last episodes. But one area I did not have input into much at all was in sets, unfortunately, or costumes. I would occasionally, one of the creators, usually the showrunner, John Steinberg, would contact me and say, hey, the director we've got coming on for the next episode saw some documentary and they were bouncing cannonballs off the water into the side of the ship, and he thought that would be cool. Did people actually do that? And I'm like, no, not unless they wanted to lose the shot. There was a late 16th century recommendation that basically said it's better to if you're going to miss, it's better to miss low than high because the round might bounce off the water and hit the side of the ship. But if you miss high, and this is assuming you're aiming at the hull, and that's all it means, you don't bounce shot off the water because you're going to lose them. But director had seen it on TV and he wanted to use it.
Right.
Another time, the art director contacted him and wanted to have a shot with all the ships at anchor. Mm-hmm. All the ships at anchor with the sail set, because it looked good. And John was asking me, he says, well, do they actually do this? And I said, well, are they drying the sails? It look kind of sloppy if you do that. And he's like, no. I said, excuse me. And there were some rare other reasons, like stemming a tide, excuse me, that you might have a couple of sails set. And then it's a decision of whether he wants to fight with the art director over it. And so a lot of what you see that's inaccurate, and I've seen this in other places in Hollywood, it's because there's so many diverse elements involved in it, and sometimes they just don't want it. They want to avoid conflict, or they just don't want to get into another argument or a fight with somebody, or who cares? The audience won't know. If you notice, most of the ships, they look beautiful on that show. Most of them would probably sink. They are not. They're creations of the artist. They don't quite match any real ships. The Urca de Lima is not an Urca, which is just a flute. It doesn't even remotely resemble what the ship would have looked like, things like that. But the audience seemed to eat it up. They don't seem to notice it.
When I told one of my close friends that I was going to interview you, he looked you up and he sent me a screenshot from Black Sails where the Spanish are sailing in these white rowboats, and they're wearing the armor and the Morayan helmets.
Yeah. I've actually got quite a few some annotations in the Captain Blood I'm working on, basically going back to the history, but also explaining why everybody uses that. But it's, working with the Firelock Games early on, we put one of the Spanish militia in the Morion just because everybody expects it. But then we created a backstory for the game players that, it was the militiaman's grandfather's helmet, because nobody actually wore those things. So they managed to slip it in that way because it's, we wanted everything to be historically accurate, but so slip it in, but have an excuse for why this guy is actually wearing it. But they did get the flags correct. That was one area which some of the set designers, the gentleman who was in South Africa who was designing the Spanish flags, contacted me repeatedly, and I just sent him tons of material, including some things from the Rijksmuseum in the Netherlands. They actually have parts of some of the original flags captured in the 17th century, including some beautiful Spanish ensigns that have been painted on unleaded and very, very detailed, with the pillars, the Spanish
Yeah.
arms, the pillars of Hercules and everything, and sent all those to him. He did a really good job with the flag. So,
Oh, nice.
bad costumes, good flags.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a shame that we haven't really seen any pirate media yet that really features the sloops and the piraguas. And though there is piraguas are mentioned in the series I just talked about, and it's something that that I enjoyed. That really showed, as you said, that the writers are well read, because there are mentions of the real history. Like there's also a mention of Henry Jennings, who was of course very important in establishing Nassau and popularizing it.
Yeah, one of the other things I will praise the writers for too is you can judge a lot of people, supposed, experts or people who are knowledgeable by whether they will ask questions and defer to other authorities as well. I had one of my fencing masters was an Olympic gold medalist, very fine gentleman. Actually, both of them were world-class fencers, but neither of them ever assumed they knew everything. Eugene Homori, I would ask him when I started teaching. He was my mentor, and I'd ask him a particular question. And primarily we were teaching a lot of epee, and I'd ask him an epee question, and he would say, "Yes, Ben." He says, "I have my answer for you," but he says, "I was really a saber fencer." And he says, "I teach all weapons, but I was really a saber fencer. Let me ask my friend Joe Sakovitz. He's the national coach, epee coach in Hungary, and he was a world champion and all this." And it was nice. It's nice to work with people like that. And Black Sails, the writers were all like that. They didn't think, "Oh, I don't need your expertise." Even though they may have read, they would still ask questions, and so that they could get more information. And as opposed to some experts, it's like, "Well, I don't. They just they don't need help from anybody or anything because they're experts."
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, I mean, if you truly enjoy something, you want to learn more about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've got 20 or 30,000 words of corrections to the Sea Rovers corrections, supplementary material, and other in a PDF online, because you keep learning new things, and some of the things you thought you knew were really incomplete. You didn't have a good picture. Some things are just incorrect, based on the information you had at the time.
Yeah.
And a lot of things you learn that really supplement that. And, I wouldn't even mind revising that book one day, but it would probably be another 30,000 pages. I mean, 30,000 words longer if I did.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm gonna read all of them.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, no, I can relate. A lot of the early videos I did were not so well researched, and of course I learned new information since then. But of course I've deleted most of those videos because I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and I want to get as much accurate information as much out there, and not mislead.
There's nothing wrong with that, particularly in this day and age. Just to try to stick to facts and get your arguments where they need to be and get them well documented, and don't use Wikipedia as
for sure. But what did you enjoy most about the experience, as in working on Black Sails?
Probably working with the writers. They were good people. It was enjoyable watching how they worked, because it's very much a collaborative effort. It's when I was a naval officer, Navy SEAL, people have a misunderstanding of Navy SEALs. They think it's a bunch of guys who can run and swim really fast, and it's nothing like that. I mean, Hollywood is, I had a woman tell me once, look at me and says, "You don't look like you could have been a Navy SEAL." And I said, "How many have you met?" Of course, she hadn't met any, but she'd seen Hollywood films.
Yeah.
But that was really about teamwork more than anything else. Teamwork, and as well as adaptability and flexibility, being able to adapt as necessary and immediately, and work together. And that's really 90% of what it is. And I enjoyed watching Black Sails because you saw a lot of that in there. They worked well together. And I think that's a credit to the two shows, the show's two creators. And so that was enjoyable, watching the process, being part of something that at least was going to be semi-accurate and maybe try to get a lot of the details, something different than the usual pirate caricatures in there. So it was also a good learning experience for me. I did not mind the annual free trips out to LA for, their premiere, or sticking me up at a nice hotel, or flying me out first class either. I didn't have a problem with that either.
Yeah.
The best part was working with, good people. And something else I found it working with them, or even in interviews when people ask me questions, it gives me a different point of view, a different perspective, and it often makes me think about what I actually know, and it shows up gaps in my own knowledge, and it actually helps me fill a lot of those gaps. The question that they would ask, and also Firelock Games, as they were researching, really showed me how much I didn't know. And so I went around trying to fill those gaps as well. It gave me an excuse to, anytime you're questioning somebody or trying to poke holes in something, it's always a good thing. You really start learning on how much you actually know and how much you don't know. And often we find that I've never thought I've known everything, but it's like when I started teaching fencing, I thought, well, maybe I know 25% of what there is to know. And I very quickly learned that I knew a lot less than 25%. It's even now with all the research I've done, I'm still learning a lot of things, and it helps to have people, poke and prod and ask questions. And
Right.
I'm talking about intelligent questions, and I don't mean to sound patronizing by that, but I'm not going to get in a debate on Facebook with somebody who's read a couple of books or sources. And one thing about studying a subject for years and years and years is you start to see patterns that, if you've only read a couple of sources or a handful of sources, it's not quite the same thing as having gone through hundreds and thousands of these things, because you really do start seeing patterns of behavior, and you can almost start predicting what might be in the gaps of your knowledge. You start thinking, I think this tactic might have existed. And it turns out you're correct. You'll find, months or years later, just by accident, trip over something and you're saying, aha, I did think they did that. You can't prove it, but because you've seen these patterns and you get a sense of the rhythms and how things are done, you can start filling in the gaps, and then you can start looking for proof and see if they actually did, because that's what you really want. You want proof. It's even though you're about 99% sure that they may have done this, it's always nice to find proof in what was it? Is it Fortune's Wealth? Yeah, Fortune's Wealth. I think I'd written a scene. I know we can get into that later, but I'd written a scene where one vessel was capturing another, and they wanted to make it look like they hadn't captured it yet, so they kept firing randomly. And with my background, the military and everything, I think that sounds like that would be a reasonable tactic, but I had not actually seen it. A couple of years ago, I actually ran across an English vessel. This was during the Dutch Wars in the 17th century. I think it might have actually been they were going after a Portuguese vessel at the time, Portugal, but they were under the guns of a Portuguese fort, and if I recall correctly, and they just captured a vessel, but they knew that as soon as the gunners at the Portuguese fort realized the vessel was captured, they just start firing on both of them. So that the illusion that the fighting was still continued. And I'm like, aha. So, it's things like that which are make your head swell a little bit too when you think I got it right. But it's nice. It's fun to find things like that. Is fill in those gaps. It's something you predicted based on, again, these rhythms and information and kind of an insight you start getting into these things, and then to find out that you are actually correct in your predictions.
Yeah, but combat is always about improvisation. It's such a random element to it.
Yeah, and luck, and it's a mess.
But yeah, back on the topics of black sails. Do you think that Charles Vane should have worn a wig, like in the general history of the fiction?
I rather doubt. I think I probably mentioned this to you in an email, but I rather doubt that any of those images are historically accurate. They're conjured up by an artist in London. Hold on just a second. Okay, my apologies.
That's fine.
Okay, where were we?
But yeah, wigs too warm. But it's.
I know that in the English Navy, you do find particularly some of the senior rates and things wearing wigs, along with the officers and things. Officers and others wearing wigs. I did run across. I know, a lot of films. The Caribbean, they put gentlemen and even sort of gentlemen pirate captains in the full coat, the Justaucorps and the waistcoats and everything. But I've run across a number of sources, particularly early and mid 18th century, that basically said in that climate, nobody who would normally wear that.
Yeah, Charles Leslie.
They wore their waistcoats. They put unless it was a formal occasion, they put their wigs aside, literally put a scarf over their head, even gentlemen. put their coats aside, wear their waistcoats, and that was it. So it's just too hot. I tromped through jungles and tons of equipment, long sleeves and heavy uniforms, and it's hot. And there is no way I would, that people are going to dress that hot and heavy, or Hollywood's favorite leather coats and leather this and leather that on pirates everywhere. And good luck with that.
Yeah, leather gets, it's biking equipment for when because it gets cold on a bike. But what was the hardest thing to get historically right in the show?
Well, the costumes, like I said, that I had no input in. It was a brief conversation early on or two about it. And I knew when they said that they had been talking to costume designers, one of whom said that if the profile looks like a pirate, that's what we want. And I'm taking the profile. So you're saying all the details. As long as in silhouette it looks like a pirate, it's okay. I knew I was probably not going to have much sway there. Let's see, things that I would have. I had that this morning when I looked over your questions. I had an answer for that, and I've suddenly lost it. It's either age, or I'll pretend it's because my head is filled with too many facts. But other than costumes, I really wish they had given me input into the ships so that I could do it. There was the 4th season, they had brought on a tall ship sailor to try to work with the people in South Africa to get some of the nautical scenes to look a little bit more accurate. And we were making some proposals for something getting near the finale, and there was a boarding scene, and something you can find. I found it in written descriptions, and you can see it in paintings. Is that when one ship was going to board another, the bowsprit, especially back then, they had a spritsail and a sprit topsail, and those yards are going to get broken off. So what they would do is the sprit yard, they would bring it literally in line with the bowsprit and lash it, and it would strengthen the bowsprit, but it also prevented the yard from getting lost. And they would even turn the sprit topsail vertical and lash it. And there's even some 17th century paintings that you see this in, and I thought, there, we have it. We can finally do this. I just want to do it just to make me happy, because nobody's ever shown this in a film before with boarding. Ships, they just crash into each other and sail and do anything. And so this tall ship sailor emails me back. He said, "Have you seen the vessel they're using?" No, I said, "I haven't seen any of the vessel designs for these scenes yet. I haven't looked at them." And he sent it to me, and it was some kind of strange brigantine sloop schooner. I don't know what it was, with 0 head sails and no yard, nothing on the, and I'm like, this vessel can't sail. And he's like, "Yeah, I know." So it did have some dangly netty stuff hanging off the bowsprit, because you always hang your fishing nets off the bowsprit.
Yeah.
But it was little things like that that I really, really wish I could have had a little bit more to do with on the ship. And I kept trying to get them to send me out to South Africa, and they kept saying, "Yeah, we might do that," and they never did. Most of the work, the writers, they had a calculated monthly, what would you call it? I don't know, whatever they were paying me a month to do it, was really, the writers really wanted to use all of that for themselves and keep me there, and trying to, I suspect, and I have no way of knowing this is true, they probably didn't want me to go head to head with a couple of the personalities, the set and arts people down there either.
Trying to spread too much truth.
But and I'm generally very diplomatic, but there's certain situations I really don't suffer fools. It's one thing to have polite disagreements and understand that this is a fictional show, but pompous fools are not something I have much patience with. So, and that may have been kind of apparent.
You wouldn't.
They seem to always regard me. I'm sorry.
Oh no, you wouldn't fit into the Spanish colonies very well then.
Maybe not. I have this. Something in the back of my head is always. They always seem to regard me as the writers as something kind of very serious, or something. I don't know quite how to say it. We got along very well, but their character of Woodes Rogers. There were times I actually thought, are they modeling that on me? This, that's very stern, which I'm really not. I mean, one of them actually. I would sit back in some of their sessions when I would go out to LA. And basically they just go back and forth and make proposals, and they'll try to, work these scenes out. And it's a very structured kind of format. When one person's talking, you don't interrupt them or anything, and you go back and forth. And I remember one of them, the writers just started, just cussing left and right, and then he looked at me like, "Oh my God, what am I doing?" And I started laughing, and then somebody else said, "Don't you know what he used to do?" I said, "He probably cusses all the time." And then I read a text one of my daughters, adult daughters, had sent me. It was just full of profanity over something. I don't even remember what the subject was. And I said, "Let me read you this." And I said, "She learned that from me," but they always seem to have this, I don't know what they actually thought, but I just kept thinking, were they basing some of Woodes Rogers' character? Did they model that off of me a little bit or something? I would take it as a compliment if they did, even though, the way they were at Woodes Rogers, he was a, real bad guy. And that actually might be something that I would disagree with their portrayal of Woodes Rogers. He had to be the bad guy, the corporate colonial, governor has to be the bad guy. But
right.
I have a lot more respect in a lot of ways, for Woodes Rogers and it may be because I have some sense of how difficult what he did was when he sailed as a privateer around the world.
Oh yeah.
And his trying to set up on that, that tiny little island that nobody wanted, New Providence, and run the pirates out there and try to make a go of that. So I have a lot of sympathy for him as well, knowing how difficult his position probably was. So anyway, if there's if I have one thing I was disappointed with, is probably their depiction of Woodes Rogers. It wasn't bad. The actor, I think, did a good job, but
oh yeah, no, but I mean, that kind of goes into that, because I was also wondering if there was like sort of anything in the themes or the writing or the story that you that was sort of hard to get historically right.
It's like I said earlier, it's trying to shoot. It's fiction, and they know they've got an audience out there that they need to appeal to it. And they were, I think, really trying to strike that middle ground between capturing the audience who really likes pirates, but making something new. I think one of the ways they pitched this show originally was, what was that? Is it an HBO, the Western series?
Oh yeah.
I can't
Deadwood.
think of the name of the series, right? Deadwood. Basically, a pirate Deadwood is really, I think, how they pitched the show. And you can, if you think of it that way, that you can definitely see that's what they were shooting for.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. But the writers were very, very good. I mean, they were very talented writers. They got good people on, and all the writers who were brought on board, because the writers tended to change every season, but they all said that they liked the way the show was run. They said they didn't see a lot of script changes at the last minute. They weren't, apparently a lot of these TV shows, they're literally writing scenes the day they're shooting, because they're tossing things out and editing it. And they said they really didn't see that much of a problem with this. I wasn't actually there to observe that, but that's what the writers consistently told me. And it was fun working with them. Matter of fact, the first thing, going back to something we said much earlier, the very first thing the showrunners did was fly me out when they had their first team of writers out for several days out to LA, just to stand in front of a tall whiteboard for a few hours a day for 2 or 3 days and say, these are pirate tactics and this is how pirates were, and answer all their questions. So they could basically, before the writers really started writing, say, this is what the reality was, and now you take that and do what you want. And that was a very, very good thing they did, I think, which distinguishes them, I think, from a lot of other shows, which really are trope writing in a lot of ways. It's Cutthroat Island, which is a film that I actually have a soft spot in my heart for in some ways, because I like the soundtrack and I like Gina Davis. And I really want to find women pirate captains, and you can't find them in the late 17th, early 18th century and all this, but I like that. I like Gina Davis. I like the rest of the film is awful, and the soundtrack is great. But that's very typical of pirate movies and TV shows that don't work out. They basically just take a bunch of pirate tropes, which they might call homages to earlier films, or rationalize them that way, but they string them together and hope it turns out as a film, but there's really no substance to it at all. And what Black Sails did was actually try to put substance to it. Put real people there that people you could identify with, strong storytelling. It's, I mean, there's even, you almost get a sense sometime that they're there's a few lines in there that you could almost say were Shakespearean or lifted from Shakespeare, or that they had philosophers in the show. Pirates as philosophers as opposed to repeating cliches. So,
Right.
But it was fun to work on the show, and like I said, the writers were good, and it was nice to see a good TV show. Hopefully they're not listening. I hate saying this. My wife and I watched. I'd already read the scripts, so watching each episode was a little bit different in the sense of, for me, it was more like, how did that script actually end up on TV?
Yeah.
I don't think we actually finished the last 2 or 3 episodes. I'm not sure why. That's right, kids. We have 2 kids, and it's hard to watch a lot of TV when you've got kids.
Oh yeah, especially black sails.
Yeah, at least if you want to pay attention to it. Yeah, mostly we watch a lot of old British murder mysteries, and we just kind of run them in the background over and over, and we never actually see a full episode.
How did you like the portrayal of the historical characters?
I think they were idealized. They were very good in the sense that they were idealized depictions of what we might have liked these characters to have been. Some of them I think may have been fairly accurate, but it's really hard to say. And I'll pick on one, Calico Jack Rackham. If you look at him in the film and then look at the reality. Now he probably had piratical experience prior to meeting Anne Bonny and Mary Read, but he probably did, but we don't know what it was. The only historical record of this guy is Charles Johnson in his pirate history says it was a 40-ton sloop, the fastest one around. There's no record. I think it was a 12 or 14-ton, a tiny little sloop that he stole at New Providence with a tiny crew. There were about 10 or 12 of them, including 2 women. One, if not both of whom, may have just gone along as a joyride. And for 3 months, they captured a handful of very small vessels.
Yeah, fishing boats.
A canoe. Yes, fishing boats, canoes, and 2, 3, 4 trading, sloops and maybe a small schooner. And that's about it. A tiny little crew capturing, I think I termed it mom and pop, little local vessels, just grabbing these guys. And the women, and I really, like I said, I want to see women pirates, and I suspect there were some out there, but they were in disguise, and we're never going to know about that. But there's no evidence that they were the badasses we think they were, that Hollywood, and I understand why Hollywood wants to do that. It's, like I said, I like Gina Davis in that movie.
Yeah.
I mean, my wife is, not somebody, I could see my wife in that role. And not just as a, fantasy or anything, but character-wise and everything else, like it's doing that. So it's nothing anti-feminist here about it. If anything, I'd really like to find evidence of this. But the trial evidence shows that the women only dressed as men, as far as we know. For certain one time, possibly other times when they were capturing these small vessels that didn't put up a fight, and they were basically, screaming and threatening, poor merchant seamen and poor local, traders who had already surrendered and everything. I know Black Sails turned Anne Bonny into this 2-sword. Nobody fought with 2 swords back then. And if there's anything that bothers me about the whole Anne Bonny, Mary Read, this applies to Black Sails and everybody. I was working for a little while with a screenwriter. She was trying to write a script about Anne Bonny. It's always Anne Bonny. Charles Johnson, we don't know if it's true or not, because there's zero evidence corroborating it, but there were women like this, that Mary Read had, been a soldier. Yeah. And a fighting seaman in disguise. And there are historical examples, numerous ones, of women having done things like this. So it's entirely possible it could be true. So if we assume that there's some truth to that, why Hollywood doesn't make a movie about Mary Read, who's a real badass, who apparently could, if what Johnson wrote was true, I mean, she actually fought duels. She could actually use a sword. She had been a soldier. She did all these things. But instead they give it to Anne Bonny, I guess, because she's, I don't know, redheaded and Calico Jack Rackham. It's made for Hollywood,
Right.
Calico Jack. There's no evidence that that was his actual nickname either. Johnson may have made it up, but it's, you know, it's perfect for Hollywood. It's like Blackbeard. He was made for Hollywood. He was not a great pirate, but he was made for Hollywood. You know, everybody. There's a point I try to make to people that he said, well, he captured 50 vessels, and I'm like, almost none of them put up a fight. And I said, it's about like Somali pirates. You know, they're armed guys running up and capturing basically merchant vessels that are not going to put up a fight. And historically, you find that in the early 18th century, pretty much any time a pirate encountered an English man of war, a French man of war, they lost badly. But they're, you know, it's this, the ideal, you know, it looks good on screen, and you can take that kid, just the whole name, Blackbeard, you know.
You always struck me as never being that interested in the sort of 1715 to 1725 period of piracy. So what was it like advising for that time frame?
It allowed me to put forth a number of ideas that I thought were try to get a lot of the fact about that era out there. We all think, and you'll see this in articles, even in some major magazines and things. The whole tropes about the pirates of this era, you know, that you know, naval ships were afraid to engage them. That's nonsense. You know, they wanted to engage them, and they were going to win. That these guys really weren't. They were awful at land warfare by this time. They simply didn't have the numbers, and they had lost a lot of their experience over a couple of generations. You know, it's like a military, any national military, that there's going to be a significant learning curve early on for a nation that hasn't been to war for a while, and they go in, they'll catch up, but there's going to be a big learning curve early on. And it's the same thing with these pirates. They simply were not into attacking towns anymore. And their rules had changed a little bit from the old buccaneers. And that's, you know, if you were a buccaneer, do you want to leave your crew? It's like, fine, pay for your victuals, you know, pay for the food you've eaten, see you later. That was written into the articles. These pirates are like, you're staying till the end of the cruise or else, you know. It's much more of a gang-like mentality as you get into the early 18th century pirates. And I always found that a bit off-putting in a way. There are a lot of cruel people in the late 17th century too, horribly cruel people. But as far as advising them, I knew the subject well, and it was fun because it gave me an opportunity to go back and look at what I thought I knew about it and to try to correct some of the myths about it. And hopefully that they would correct some of these things, and they did fairly well. And the tactics, and that's always fun, whether it's early 18th century or whatever. I think if you remember the opening scene, I think for the first episode, they tried to get a sense of closed quarters, of merchant seamen retreating behind closed quarters. Now, I wanted them to actually have the merchant seamen not cowering, but putting up a fight.
Well, they do that in the 5th episode, I think.
Finally got it somewhere where they did it, but the first episode, but they needed a big bang opening up, and they rolled a little powder barrel with a fuse instead of you know, chopping through the doors, because you know, if you chop through the doors and toss grenades in, it's not as dramatic as rolling an explosive device down toward the doors and breaching it. But in the sense, the gist is the same thing. It was much more accurate than I think most of the things. You know, it's usually pirates attacking merchant seamen in most movies. It's basically straight out of a couple of the Bugs Bunny cartoons. I mean, literally, they just kind of blaze away, run along, and everybody jumps on it. There's a lot of cutlass sharpening, you know, chopping each other, and then you know, the pirates win because the other guys fall down dead. But it really didn't look much like that. But they're magnificent scenes. They look great on film. You know, there's a scene in the Seahawk with early on when they're attacking a Spanish. It's actually a galleass, but you know, they've thrown the grappling hooks and they're pulling on side, and the gunnels are just lined with guys standing on top, and they're all up in the shrouds. And I used to use that giving lectures, and I'm saying, this is Hollywood's depiction. I said, all these guys standing up here, I said, they're all dead. I said, because they're all, you know, there's swivel guns and cannon loaded with grape shot and musketeers, and they're just trying to clear the decks. And anybody standing up like that's going to get knocked down. You were considered to be a brave man if you ran up the shrouds like that under fire, because it was literally so dangerous.
No, I mean, speaking about the sort of gang mentality, I think that is something that they kind of did in the series. With the, especially like I think in the 3rd season or whatever, where they Uh, hello. Who's this?
Aiden, can you go back with mommy so I can finish up? You can say hi.
Oh yeah, it's fine. I
He's
love kids.
always interested in what's going on. He had his first COVID vaccine shot this morning.
Okay.
Did really well this morning, so
When
he was proud of himself.
When are you sending me off to sea?
You're sending him off to sea? Well, if he wants to head off to sea, I guess when he's 10 years old?
Yeah.
Is that old?
Yeah, the cabin boy.
10 years old. Yeah, no way. Don't have to feed him anymore.
Oh yeah.
No, one of my adult daughters actually spent a number of summers as a tall ship sailor aboard the. You're on video, by the way. That's my wife.
All right. Hello.
Get over
Yeah.
here. I know you took the Play-Doh. Get over here.
Sorry, family drama. Apparently, he stole some Play-Doh from his sister, his 2.5-year-old
That's
sister,
a
and
good time.
he's
You have
hiding.
it. Her jar's empty. I know you have it.
Anyway, she was a tall for a number of summers, and she, as far as she's concerned, is one of her best life experiences because you learn teamwork, and it's a real world kind of teamwork. Because if you mess up, you're going to get hurt. It's like being in the military or any other kind of, or rescuing refugees in the Mediterranean, or trying to stop Japanese whalers from catching. Anything that you've got to have teamwork because you're going to get hurt if you make mistakes. Hold on, I may have to lift him out here. Aiden, come on, I've got some work to do. Grab the Play-Doh, head on out. Come on, son. He's 5 in kindergarten. Sticking his tongue out at me now for sending him out. Thanks, Mary. She's just rolling her eyes like, oh.
Oh yeah. Well, it's no problem. I love kids. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I don't know where the cat is. We've got a 16-pound cat who, if he knew I was in here, would probably be in my lap and in front of the keyboard. He looks and acts like a Norwegian forest cat, just a stray showed up years ago after a bunch of tornadoes came through. But he's, for once, usually anytime I do interviews, he's crawling on the keyboard or closing windows or doing something.
Yeah, they have a tendency to do that. I kind of forgot what we were talking about, but would you like to work in TV again?
Oh yes, it's well, I could say it's good for book sales, but really I've always liked film media. My father had been in the Navy he spent I guess about 21 years in the Navy, but he was a photographer and cinematographer in the Navy, and they actually sent him to University of Southern California, they have a famous cinema school, and they sent him there for a year cinema program back in the 60s. I think I was 5 years old in there, and some years later he was making Navy training films out of Hollywood. He didn't even have to wear his uniform, and I think for 3 years he was production supervisor for all these Navy training films, and they were in the Federal Building right off Hollywood Boulevard, where all Grumman's or Mann's Chinese Theater and all this was. And it was a pretty wild place back in the 70s. And he's let me skip school for a day every once in a while and go in with him and let me sit in the projection room. And then at lunchtime, we'd take an hour and a half off for lunch. He'd take me down on Hollywood Boulevard and, show me all the plots and places. And it was a lot of fun back then. And he, of course, naturally, he loved film. And had made a lot of his own. So, yeah, I have no problems working with like to work in TV again. I'd like to see some more serious pirate series done.
Right.
Film as well. Wouldn't mind working on or even writing a script for Captain Blood. I think it could be made and brought into. I have ideas on how it could be brought in to meet the expectations of a modern audience as well, with a few changes that would still keep it in line with I think the author's original intent. I have to be careful with it though. Ruth Heredia, who's kind of his, she wrote a 2-volume biography of him.
On Raphael Sabatini?
Yeah, she'd probably be very, very upset with me if I got too far away from the canon. She's a wonderful person. She lives in Bangalore, India. She's a wonderful person. We corresponded for years and considers me her younger brother. I think she kind of looks on me that way as well, sort of semi-advising me in some ways. And her nieces and nephew, as she calls my children. But yeah, that's a book that would have a lot of expectations. If they tried to remake a film version, you'd have people comparing it to the original or not the original, but the 35 version with Errol Flynn.
Have you seen the Treasure Island movie from 1990 with Charles Heston?
Yes, that's probably it may be my favorite version. I think it's probably the best, arguably the best version. I enjoyed that the first time, and it's hard to mess that story up, but they did a very, very good job of that, I think.
Yeah, and they definitely portrayed the combat in a very interesting and fashion. But I think that that movie isn't. It was made for TV. It wasn't very successful, but I think it kind of is a bit of evidence that you can do something like Captain Blood and do it sort of accurately.
Yeah, you got to convince network executives and that they can do it and that you can make money off of it, and they always seem to buy more into the popular caricatures tropes, and they're always failures. What was that, Crossbones, that series? It was the other pirate show. It lasted one season, and I'm not trying to diss the writers of that show, but 5 minutes into it I turned it off because it was pretty obvious it was just going to be it probably looked like a great idea on paper, and that had a great cast, but
yeah, that show is strange. I watched it with a friend. I probably couldn't have, because we wanted. We laughed at it, because it's a silly show. It's very weird. They wrote the dialogue very interestingly in that it was written sort of to be poetic in a sense. Like they kind of wrote the dialogue like how they wrote the letters in the 18th century. Of course, I don't think people spoke that sophisticated so much all the time.
Yeah, that's always the trick, I think, of TV and movies getting dialogue correct. It was near the end of Black Sails, the season, I wrote an extensive amount of material on historical swordplay for John Steinbrooks. I think he was the prince. He was going to direct the episode, and was principal writer on that episode as well. So I gave him also a lot of historical terminology, including today it would be carte and tierce in French terms. It basically means parry 4, parry 3, or as they used to say, but also say with cutting weapons inside, outside. And it was curious because they had the dialogue coach get in touch with me on how to pronounce tierce. And I said, well, we don't know, but 1 or 2 written documents back then spelled it T-E-R-S. And I said, you could probably take that as evidence that they were basically saying terse, carte and terse. It would make sense. But she said, well, an Englishman would really say tierce. And I said, well, maybe, but we have this historical evidence here that suggests they just said terse, and I don't know. I don't remember because I still have not actually seen that scene because we didn't watch the last couple of episodes. I guess we'll get around to it one of these days. Yeah. But you run into little historical issues like that, and the surprising conflicts with other perspectives. It's, the dialogue coach is really coaching in modern languages, but still trying to lend a historical flavor to it in a way. I suggested that if for African, they might want to try to see if they can find any actors who spoke Gullah from the Carolinas, because that's as close in modern speech. It's probably as close to some of the slave patois and things that were around back then. But anyway, I'm off on another tangent.
No, it's fine. But so in a lot of movies today, we sort of got the westerns and the superheroes and the sci-fi that got tons of movies, but not pirates. So why do you think that the pirate genre isn't as popular as it could be?
It, in part because it's been over caricaturized. I'm not sure if that's a word, but they were turned into this very literally a trope or a caricature. I use those words a lot, but they're Westerns were reinvented back starting, I think, in the 60s and 70s and made realistic. And Black Sails and the Treasure Island version that you mentioned are probably the only shows that have tried to do that with pirate films. I was told by one of the showrunners that there were 6 pirate shows, including theirs, in production or in early production or planned for production at the time they started writing, and they were asking me if I'd heard anything else, probably thinking, well, he's written books on piracy, they may have contacted him, but I hadn't heard anything. And of all those 6, only 2 went into production, and only one of them lasted more than 1 season. It's if you go back and look at a lot of the pirate films that have really created the modern genre, it's not really Captain Blood, I think, or even Treasure Island, which are the ones that would stand out most. It's all of those kind of over the top, almost campy in a way films, ranging from The Black Swan, which was not bad, all the way into some of just the silly ones that were in the 50s and managed to make their way into the 60s. And I think it doesn't help that a lot of these films bombed, and Walter Matthau and Pirates, the film, bombed. Cutthroat Island is got a second life on DVD and Blu-ray, but it bombed. I mean, so you've got these films that just have done terribly, and that may have something to do with it. I'm not sure, but it's also a problem right now in literature and fiction as well. You see some occasional novels that come out and they may do okay, but there's not a huge following for them except in fantasy. And somebody even suggested, they said, well, you could write pirate fantasy, like pirate sci-fi. And it's like, well, not really interested. But
I think the benefit of pirate fantasy is that there is this thing in fantasy where fantasy can afford to be very dark without attracting a lot of critique. Like in a fantasy, a lot you can feature. I mean, if you look at a lot of like popular fantasy, like I guess Lord of the Rings, like genocide is something that's really glossed over in fantasy. But you always have like these different races, like I don't know, orcs and elves that always, I mean, they genocide each other, but it's not, no one bats an eye at it because they think, well, it's fictional races. So I think like a lot of the darker themes that happen in pirate history, like slavery, like that's something that possibly could only really be explored in fantasy, which, I mean, it's a shame. But
yeah, well, I'm stubborn. I'll keep flogging at this until it works or it doesn't work. Keep trying to make it, the reality work. Romantic reality, there's the aspiration is. And, looking back at my life, it does work in reality. You can, go out and do adventurous things and have a very romantic yet realistic view of the world, but I'm still not quite sure how to translate that. Or maybe I just need more talent as a writer or something too, but I still think it can be done. I'd still like to see it be done in film as well in this genre. It's the swashbuckling genre in general is down. Arturo Perez Reverte, his A la Triste novels were being published in English. The first, I think, 6 were, but the 7th, they just dropped it, didn't publish. I had to read it in French. My Spanish is just not, my wife is a Spanish teacher, but my Spanish is just simply not good enough to read a sophisticated Spanish novel, but so I read it in French. But they dropped it in the U.S. because there's just not enough market for it. And there's some of the best recent, and they're historically accurate, so they're definitely a little bit darker. I think a critic said they were too industrial, and I was thinking, no, they're just realistic. But it's still, what do they call it? Cape and sword. Yeah. It's just much more realistic, but it's still swashbuckling adventure, and I enjoyed them. But I'm not sure if that genre is going to get rebuilt again. That's another one that has slipped into fantasy to some degree in science fiction, but getting into the reality, and it's it's the things I grew up on as a child. Some of the books that stuck with me the most, Sabatini and Dumas, and I separate those out from more serious literature. Captain Blood may be one of my favorite novels. It's certainly not the best novel I've ever read, but it's one of my, it's right up there with a number of other books. So I don't know if I've got a good answer for you or how to, I've been trying to, get the genre moving again. But
no, I mean, I understand what you mean, that it's really been played by this sort of stereotypization or this characterization. And it's ultimately, like I said earlier, it's, you can't really dig deep into it. And nowadays, I guess the pirate media is also kind of, the expectation is on Pirates of Caribbean, of course, and what draws a lot of people into that is the sea monsters and stuff like that.
The fantasy elements. It's really just fantasy, pirate fantasy, I guess, or fantasy with some extensive pirate elements in it. My mother, I remember, she wanted to see a fun swashbuckler like she used to watch when she was a kid. And as soon as she saw, the living skeletons in the first one, she was like, I can't do this. Sorry.
Well, what do you think is the future of pirate media?
I don't know. Right now, it's probably in video games. Unfortunately, I suspect at some point it'll be reinvented, hopefully with a more realistic basis. But it's going to require a director who can get the funding and get a studio on board with it. And as you know, I know you just from observation, that Hollywood that tends to repeat what's popular at the moment. What was it? The reality TV, which has nothing to do with reality. As soon as one show hit it, everybody started making it. The Harry Potter novels get popular, and then you go in the children's book section, and it's all 90% fantasy and imitation of it. I suspect the genre may come back if somebody can make a good film. But the Johnny Depp, nobody's really been trying to imitate that. They thought about it, but they didn't really do it. So I don't know. There are a lot of values. The whole swashbuckling genre itself. If they just wanted to just reinvent the genre as a genre, not even as realistic as we might want it to be, but just go look at some of the core values. That the fantasy of pirates as freedom fighters. You would think it would still be it would be a lure to studios, especially in this time. It's Black Sail sort of came close to that, trying to ally pirates and slaves and, overthrow the hated, corporate empire or whatever they were overthrowing.
Yeah.
But you would think that would be somewhat appealing and not just a bunch of silly nonsense about treasure hunting tossed together. I can understand the allure of treasure hunting, though. I've had several treasure hunters contact me, and they know what Captain's Kid treasure is, and I'm like, it doesn't exist, and they will not believe you. You cannot convince them. I said, here's all the evidence. I'll guarantee you it's not there, and they're just obsessed with it. And maybe they think that for films that's the same thing. It's always a good story, treasure hunting, but I'll remain hopeful on it. And if not, I've got a lot of other fiction I'd like to write and I'm working on as well that's not really associated with pirates. But
okay. But you mentioned video games a bit. Do you know anything about pirate video games?
To keep my fingers in what's going on in that, I've probably played most of the recent ones, not all of them. I'm trying to think, get their names of them. They're in a lot of ways very arcade-like. Of course, very quick action and not that historically accurate, but they seem to have gotten a little bit better. What is it? Assassin's Creed Black Flag or something. I would prefer that they would get rid of all the Assassin's nonsense and just make a pirate. But again, the games seem to fall into the same thing that all video games, I guess, fall into, just a lot of repetitive action. I actually haven't looked too closely at it in the last couple of years to see what's going on with it. Honestly, though, I did play, what was the Odyssey, Assassin's Creed Odyssey. I played that a little bit because, that was one of the golden ages of piracy, actually. And I have to say that as far as if there's a pirate video game, that's probably one of the more accurate ones that's actually out there, which is an era of piracy that most people know nothing about.
Right.
Antiquity, which is, the piracy of the last few centuries pales in comparison to what went on in antiquity or even the Middle Ages. Those were the true golden ages. Thousands of these people at sea and, being used as mercenaries and just literally setting up petty empires and all sorts of things that we pretend happened in the late 17th, early 18th century, but never actually did.
No, I think one thing which is really, I think, a problem in the sort of pirate community is that there's this big fascination with pirates that were quote unquote successful, like talking about Bartholomew Roberts and his 400 fishing boats, or people always talk about Xing Shi, and the problem with that is that you always leave out the pirates that weren't necessarily so successful but that had really interesting stories, like Bartholomew Sharp, for example, those other guys. And
those I'm far more interested in those pirates, and that it's somebody would ask me, "What's your favorite pirate ship?" It's like I think you're going to ask that question, but Hollywood always wants these 3-deck first. I'm more interested in the smaller vessels that people actually got their hands on.
Right.
It's like people posting pictures of swords. There are always these rare swords made for a prince with all these jewels on them, as opposed to the actual functional, weapons of high quality that people would actually have used, in the field and in battle. People seem to be drawn to the gilded and the great, as opposed to, these great stories, as you're saying, the actual workhorses, the people who really got out there and got their hands dirty and did things. And to me, that's far, far more appealing than, I have to remember too, these early 18th century pirates had Charles Johnson or Nathaniel Mist, whoever he was. Or several writers, as I suspect, doing, and Mist was probably the editor. I suspect that was a co-produced book by a number of basically workhouse or publisher in-house writers,
okay.
but basically hyping the publicity for sales. There's a lot of people, that I know it's popular in scholars to read all kinds of things into Charles Johnson's book, but I strongly suspect that its true intent was simply sales. Like, I've dealt with a lot of publishers, and they haven't changed in 3 centuries. And it's, if you look, I'm not going to get political right now, but anybody who was in the last administration in the U.S. has got a book out, partly to cover their tails and try to explain why they would work for that administration. But they're withholding information that the public really should have had months or years ago. And there's only one reason for that. It's for sales. Drop a couple of
and I mean on the main cover of on the main cover of General History, it says containing the stories of these 2 pirate women. It's working on the on that existing market of the female rogues.
Yeah, and there's a good reason to have exaggerated or even grossly exaggerated, and it's for sale. So I strongly suspect that there's really not much in the way of political intent or behind that book, or any secret we're gonna back the governments. To me it just looks like a book that was written to maximize sales and nothing more.
No, but
again, I have kind of a cynical attitude toward publishers. And
no, I think we might get into that a bit later, but of course the next part of the interview is kind of going to concern Fortune's Whelp. But I need to go and take a piss first, if you allow me that.
Oh, please do. You don't have to sit there with a bottle or anything.
Legend says it that Benerson is still waiting to this day, because the next part of the interview will be covered in a future video. In that part, we will be talking all about Benerson's experiences with writing pirate fiction and his own novel, Fortune's Whelp. Stay tuned. Until then, don't forget to check out his excellent blog, which contains detailed articles on some rather obscure pirate topics. I'll leave a link in the video description, along with some Amazon links to his books. Huge thanks to my generous supporters over on Patreon: Cole Freer, Max Dweck, Captain Dean York, RadRed88, Michael Jans, Rachel, and Blunderbomb. If you want to support me monetarily, please check out the links to PayPal and Patreon in the description below. Otherwise, please give the video a like and a comment to help the algorithm spread it to more potential viewers. And why don't you share the video with a friend who's into history? Cheers.